Hello, my name is Ciarán Reilly, and my video for Heritage Week 2020 examines the impact of the Great Famine in Offaly, which began 175 years ago this month. This video is funded by Creative Ireland and is brought to you by Offaly Libraries. The failure of the potato crop in the autumn of 1845 was the cause of the Great Famine, which would in a short space of time lead to the deaths of 1 million people and force 1 million more to emigrate. First brought to Ireland in the 1500s, it wasn't until the 1780s that it started to become the staple food of the Irish. Over the course of the next 70 years or so, the potatoes consumption led to an explosion in population, which rose from 2 million in 1780 to just over 8.5 million in the early 1840s. The potato was a popular choice of food because it could be grown in patchy and poor soil, but it was prone to failure. Indeed, between 1700 and 1845, there were as many as 27 failures of the potato crop. That is, one failure almost every 5 years. In the autumn of 1845, this mysterious blight, which made its way rapidly across the country, reaching Offaly by the end of September, spelled disaster for more than half the population, who were entirely dependent on it. The potato was the staple diet of the people of Offaly, be it those living in the fertile baronies of Clonlisk and Ballybrit to the south, to those inhabiting the boggy, uncultivated baronies of Coulstown and Garrycastle in the north east and the west of the county, respectively. The first reports of potato blight in Offaly in late September 1845 were somewhat optimistic that the crop would not be as badly affected as first feared. Some estimates suggested that less than 1/3 or so of the potato crop would be affected, but heavy rain throughout early October led to flooding in many parts of Offaly, making it difficult to save those potatoes which were unaffected by blight. This change in fortunes was outlined by Joseph Grogan, who wrote from Philipstown, or Dangan, in October 1845, "With regard to the potatoes, at the first time I wrote to you, there was not the least appearance of damage on them, but at this moment there appears to be great damage to the potato crop in this county, or any other part that I am in the habit of travelling along the canal line, but it is damaged more or less, and the people appears to be greatly alarmed on that account." It was the same in Edenderry, where Edward Wolstenholme feared that there would not be a sound potato after Christmas. Indeed, there are none sound at the moment. There were some suggestions that Lord Ross, as Lord Lieutenant of the county, mishandled initial investigations into the cause and extent of the potato disease, misinterpreting reports sent to him by Francis Berry, Lord Charleville's agent at Tullamore, amongst others. But despite this, landlords such as Ross and others adopted different measures to cope with the crisis. The aforementioned Grogan at Dangan suggested storage pits for potatoes, which were unsound. George Heenan, Lord Ross's agent at Burr, purchased rotten potatoes from tenants. And James Devery at Clohan championed turnips as an alternative food source. And during the initial phase of famine in the winter months of 1845 leading into 1846, there was reason to remain optimistic in Offaly. Winter markets reported good returns, and there were many animals for sale. The Great May Fair of 1846 at Ballycumber produced plentiful supplies of pigs and stocks, and generally good prices were got. At Clara, over 700 barrels of corn were sold on a single day at the market. Thus, in the early stages of the famine, landlords acted favourably by granting abatements of rent, forgiving arrears, and educating tenants on washing and preparing affected potatoes. However, it was, as William O'Connor Morris of Mount Pleasant would later write, a misguided belief that the famine would be short-lived. In other respects, however, the management of the famine crisis in Offaly was fairly haphazard. Probably the biggest problem lay in the petty squabbling which existed over boundaries and divisions for relief committees and their work. Some areas, such as Geeshel, lay unaccounted for, while these squabbles persisted, giving rise to what Henry Norwood Tyre described as a miserable and mutinous peasantry in the village. Likewise, the Reverend Digby refused to raise funds for neighbouring parishes, instead confining himself to those in his own neck of the woods. As the summer of 1846 came and went, and with it a second failure of the potato crop was realised, the people of Offaly began to worry as another winter approached. Although Reverend Henry Turrell wrote from Kinnetty that the people were quiet and patient, their desperation was evident elsewhere. Pawn shops sprung up across the county, including those in Tullamore, Banagher and Birr, and soon swelled with whatever could be sold by the poor. In the parish of Eglish, Reverend Robert Healy appealed for help, as there was, quote, no employment for the destitute and no food to appease the cravings of hunger. Tenants on the Holmes estate at Shinrone also petitioned for help following the failure of the potato crop, and they wrote, we, the under-mentioned tenants on the Kilcommon estate, having been served with processes for arrears of rent, submit their cases severally to your consideration, hoping that in the present cases you will not take proceedings against them, as this year is particular in turning out a year of severe hardship for the potatoes. We expected we could hold this summer's provisions for ourselves and for our families. Should you proceed against us generally, we do not know what we will do in the present trying circumstances, so we humbly hope your Honour will consider us in the present cases for which we are duty bound to pay. The winter of 1846 and 1847 was particularly harsh in Offaly. Snow lay on the ground for several weeks. At Edenderry, the Reverend James Colgan wrote that distress daily increases in the town amongst all classes of the poor, and that families were in a pitiful condition. It was no better in nearby Dangan, where it was warned that the hungry would soon resort to harsh measures. And in Clara, Lydia Goodbody wrote that there was general humiliation on account of the failure of the potato crop. It was hardly surprising then that the people of Offaly turned to crime. On average, 8 robberies or serious crimes were reported on a daily basis, although the number was likely to have been higher. In Banagher, J.W. Armstrong and others appealed for protection when bringing corn and meal to their mills. So often targeted were they. It had also become impossible to move flour and other foodstuffs near Ballycumber. In Forban, whole turnip fields were turned up in a night and carried away. And in Birr, in an effort to prevent food leaving the town's bridges were broken down. Amid this growing unrest, attention soon turned to landlords and the gentry in general. A petition on behalf of the starving tenants in Ballyboy criticised the gentry, who they claimed were wallowing in the riches of the world. Some took their desperation to the landlords' doors. In December 1846, William Lloyd, a landlord, was shot dead at the door of his home in Birr, after serving several eviction notices. Likewise, Owen Power, another landlord or middleman, was murdered in the same town in April 1847 in a dispute over access to land. And threatening notices and letters were posted to all those connected with landed estates. A notice pinned at the door of Busherstown House, the residence of George Minchin, for example, threatened him with death if he did not change his ways and help the poor. Despite this unrest and pressure on the landed elite, the debt toll amongst the lower orders continued in Offaly into 1847, or Black 47 as it would come to be known. Some, but not all of these debts are recorded in the diaries of James Dillon, County Coroner for Offaly, during the famine years. Dillon's diaries highlight the huge increase in inquests which he carried out, and in particular during 1847, which shows that typhus fever, amongst other diseases, was making its way to the poor of Offaly with some rapidity. Famine, wrote Lydia Goodbody of Clara, exists beyond what can be remembered, even by the oldest man. The desperation of the poor of Offaly was very evident during the early months of Black 47. At Kinnity, a man named Higgins dropped dead on the road from starvation, having stopped at a neighbour's house for food, but to which he was refused. Likewise, a man making his way to the public works near Palace dropped dead on the road from hunger. And in April 1847, 300 starving men marched into Banagher and demanded relief from John Burdett, a chairman of the Relief Committee, who urged that they would remain calm throughout the proceedings. The starving crowd responded that they wanted work or blood, and that they were determined not to die like dogs. Dispersed by a detachment of the military, the crowd made their way to Lusma, where they made similar demands. Often it was difficult to control these groups of starving paupers who roamed the Offaly countryside, seeking relief or work. At Dangan, a group of men broke into the house of a farmer named Darby Hogan and beat him severely as they sought assistance or some form of relief. At Burr, a man named Dillon was shot while trying to protect a field of turnips which was being overturned at night. And a similar attack was made on a man called Peyton, who minded fields at night between Palace and Calahi. The said Peyton was said to have been beaten within an inch of his life. Although initially refused permission to establish more soup kitchens, local workhouse guardians complained in early 1847 that this form of relief was necessary to feed the masses in Offaly. Francis Berry, for example, complained at this time that the poor were committing crimes simply to be put in jail, so that they would be fed. Tullamore Jail, he noted, had 200 more people than it could cater for as a result. And trying to cater for the poor, those like Berry decided to establish their own soup provisions. In Tullamore, Berry, for example, gave out recipes or soup made from recipes which he had been given by Lady Charleville. Throughout 1846 and 1847, the provision of work on the public works schemes in Offaly had stemmed the tide of hunger somewhat. Although many were themselves too weak to work on the public works, they still clamoured for inclusion. When relief works were stopped, for example, in Clareen in 1846, the poor warned that they would, quote, not die like cowards, and that all they wanted was to work. It was the same in Burr, where 150 men entered the Burr Castle domain, demanding work from Lord Ross. By the summer of 1847, there were 12,000 people in Offaly working on the public works. 1/5 of them were located in the barony of Ballyboy. And one of the great success stories of the famine in Offaly was the public works schemes which took place along the River Brosna, which saw more than 16,000 acres of land drained during this period. The work also included the widening of rivers, the building of weirs, the building and construction of new bridges and arches, and the underpinning of mills. This work, in 5 or 6 short years, altered the landscape of Offaly forever, and undoubtedly saved thousands of lives in the process. Thousands of lives were also saved with the provision of outdoor relief in Offaly during the famine years. However, much of the work carried out by these outdoor relief stores, which were often attached to the local workhouse, is now lost to history. However, one remarkable source describing this work survives for Shinrone and details the experiences of famine for the people of South Offaly. While there's been an outpouring of publications in the past 20 years or more about the Great Famine, we still know very little of how it impacted on a personal and familial level. Moreover, in certain parts of the country, owing to the absence of census data, we do not know even the names of those who endured the most during the famine. The information contained then in the Shinrone famine relief list is revealing on a number of levels and includes names, ages, residence, occupations, the conditions of the people, the gender, the average size of the holdings, and the marital status, whether people were married, single, widowed, or otherwise. Analysing the data from this document in relation to age shows that the famine hit all age groups, but with the young and old most vulnerable. Many of these are described as being sick and old, such as Mary Butler, aged 70, or helpless, and in the case of one poor 6-year-old boy, he was described as deformed and sickly. And there were those like Mary Ward of Ballytoran, who was blind and the oldest recipient of relief in the area, and Benjamin Lewis of Towra, aged 85, an army pensioner who was born in 1762. Others were described as being sick and unable to work in any of the relief schemes, including Michael Tracy, aged 36, who was suffering from swelling in the limbs. And the lists also highlight that there were a number of illegitimate children, suggesting perhaps that as the famine got worse, they were abandoned or left at workhouses in Roscrea. There were also those like Jane Donlan, aged 35, who was described as a beggar and who then sought relief. Another child, aged 4, and named as Thomas Grant, was with his grandfather, Michael Grant, who could not work because of swelling of the limbs. And the inclusion of occupations also provides interesting information about famine Offaly and the makeup of the village and the wider hinterland around Shinrone. The documents suggest a community of cottage industries existed in this part of Offaly on the eve of the famine, and that many supplemented their income with a host of activities. For example, the list includes occupations such as masons, carpenters, weavers and shoemakers. Robert Delaney of Shinrone was described as a postboy, and Dennis Quinlan, a sailor, not then employed. A number of recipients, including the Walsh family, were listed as labouring at the river, presumably a reference to famine relief projects already in operation near Shinrone. And as we know from the history of more illustrious natives of this area, shoemaking was a major business of the time, something which John McDermott had done before he fell on hard times. Others, then in receipt of relief, had been employed in local big houses, such as Cancourt, and in the employment of the Atkinson family. Naturally, many were listed as labourers, but women too, like Ellen Ryan, aged 50, were employed as occasional labourers on farms and in other public works. Writing some 50 years after the Great Famine, William O'Connor Morris of Mount Pleasant recalled, quote, "The lean and wolfish faces of many of those are stamped on my mind, even as I write now." However, for the county's elite, life went on as normal during the famine years. Feasting and dining continued, as did music and entertaining, sports and leisure likewise. An account of this social activity in Offaly during the famine years makes for interesting reading. In January 1846, the coming of age of the aforementioned O'Connor Morris himself was attended by over 160 people who enjoyed a sumptuous meal. Likewise, in February 1847, over 150 people attended a dinner at Thomastown House at Drumcullen, the home of the Bennett family. And there were other such festivities, including at Shara where the celebrated piper Cunningham entertained the guests, and the picnic which took place at Strawberry Hill House in Cloughan, which was said to have been on a magnificent scale. This continuation of life as normal throughout the famine years is probably what Mildred Darby of the Lep Castle had in mind when she wrote in her 1910 famine novel The Hunger, which depicts the scale of hunger in Offaly at this time, that, quote, "Hosts and guests had discussed the potato blight and speculated over its cause with their soup and fish. They had commented with many head shakings upon the prevailing scarcity of food, while great dishes filled by smoking joints and artistic entrees provided them with a pleasant contrast to their topic of conversation." As 1848 dawned and the people of Offaly prepared themselves for yet another year of famine, there was a marked change in the attitude of those in authority and the middle classes in general. At Killahey, in an effort to prevent strangers and strollers from coming to the area, Richard Gamble warned that those who gave lodgings or food would be struck from relief lists. In Tullamore, Dawson French and others began to clear the streets of the town of nuisances and the diseased. In Edenderry, Richard Grattan and the Board of Guardians set up a cordon to prevent those fleeing famine in the western counties of Mayo and Galway from seeking refuge in the town. Grattan wrote that, quote, "The people of Edenderry are determined not to have the frightful scenes of other places enacted there, of hundreds of corpses lying unburied on the road and ditches and devoured by dogs." However, perhaps the most vocal critic of the continued assistance to the poor was the Borough Poor Law Guardian, John Perscrow, who in 1848 thundered at a meeting of the Board of Guardians that it was truly ridiculous to be wasting so much of their valuable time in talking over such unimportant matters. It was all sympathy for paupers, beggars and brats, and in what way they were to be made comfortable, as they had not been used to cabins and hovels of the meanest and filthiest kind from their birth. Such talk was really monstrous and absurd, and while all the pity was for the beggars, there was no sympathy for the landlords and the gentlemen of the country, at whose expense these persons were to be fed sumptuously. Following the introduction of the so-called quarter-acre clause, which denied relief to those occupying more than a quarter of an acre of land, Offaly landlords, after almost 3 years of famine, began to adopt new measures to deal with the continuing catastrophe. In many instances, they sought simply to turn to eviction. In 1849, for example, 619 families, or 3,255 people, were evicted in Offaly. In 1850, the number was higher, 652 families, amounting to 3,346 people. The evictions and the evictees included, for example, 31 families at Monaghan, evicted by the agent George Greason in late 1848, 126 people in Kinnetty in March 1849, 6 families evicted from the Harndon estate at Burr in May 1849, 20 people removed from the Reverend Minchin's estate at Moneygall, 42 families or 220 people evicted from the estate of Offaly's repeal MP, Sir Andrew Armstrong, in 1851. And as the figures show, these are just a fraction of the number which were made to suffer the fate of eviction. For many people in Offaly, as they faced starvation and or eviction, the workhouse was the only alternative to death, although for almost 6,000 people this would inevitably be their outcome. It was little wonder then that Henry Shane, agent of the Bell estate at Banagher, would write that the people of Offaly would rather die in the ditch than go there. Built following the implementation of the Irish Poor Law Act in 1838, these buildings were designed to cater for the poor, but not in a time of famine. Edenderry, for example, was built to cater for 600 people, but 3 years into famine was so overcrowded that it had 3 times that number. In 1848 and 1849, cholera and typhus spread through Offaly, killing hundreds. At Borough Workhouse, over 100 people died in one week alone. And by 1851, Francis Berry feared the further spread of the disease in Tullamore Workhouse because the people were dying quicker than they could be buried. As the disease continued to spread through the county and the levels of poverty increased, naturally people resorted to crime as a means of survival, but also of settling old scores. People vied for land, and often this led to disputes between family, friends and neighbours. At Clonmacnoise, for example, in early 1850, the murder of a man named Deegan by his brother epitomised these divisions. But the most obvious and important manifestation of this unrest could be seen in the attacks and murders which were committed in Offaly during the famine years. These included the murder of Charles Trench Cage at Forban in October 1849, the murder of Robert Pike at Killeen in August 1850, and the murder of William Ross Manifold at Palace in 1852. Others were more fortunate. Patrick Fallon, for example, agent of the Dowdall estate at Ballycumber, survived several attacks on his life, as did George Garvey, agent of as many as 7 estates in County Offaly during the famine years. Bailiffs, rent warners and other estate officials were also attacked and severely beaten. Such were the conditions in Offaly that it was unsurprising that many chose emigration, where possible, as a means of escaping the worst excesses of famine. In 1850 it was said about Burr that emigration is almost daily enacted in this town on the departure of the long car to meet the Grand Canal passage boat on its way to Dublin. The office from which it leaves is generally for some short time before its leaving surrounded by a crowd of emigrants and their friends, the latter of whom, with trifling expressions of grief, largely mingled with shouts of exultation, take leave of their friends and pursue them with loud promises of soon joining them in their distant homes. The immediate aftermath or toll of the Great Famine in Offaly was visibly striking. Almost 35,000 people had disappeared in the intercensus period 1841 to 51. In today's terms, that would be like removing half of the present population of the county. The decline was also striking in the fact that there were over 5,600 uninhabited houses, and hundreds more were levelled into the earth. Overnight, whole villages such as Brosna, Clononey and Ballinagar were virtually wiped out. In the county's workhouses, the graveyards were full. 6,000 paupers were buried in the workhouses of Offaly during the famine years. In Edenderry, Tullamore and Burr, their names were most likely never recorded, or at least have now been lost to social memory. The county's population would continue to decline over the coming decades. Those, like the 75 people assisted in immigration from the Ponsonby estate in Clohan, and the 140 that left the Earl of Portarlington's estate in 1849, were the lucky ones. 1 in every 4 were gone. Offaly would never be the same again. Today, at a remove of 175 years, there are many examples of folklore regarding the famine in Offaly. Until the end of the Irish War of Independence in July 1921, a hat belonging to the agent William Ross Manifold, murdered in October 1852, hung proudly in Calahi RIC barracks. Now, although that hat is long gone, the murder and his place of expiration, known locally as Manifold's Hole, is still remembered and pointed out to this day. Similarly, Pike's Tree signals the spot where Robert Pike was murdered in August 1850, and Cage's Bridge recalls the murder of Charles Trench Cage at Ferban a year previous. The role of landlords during the famine is also recalled in local folklore. In Bracknell, where Lord Ashtown carried out an eviction of over 700 people in 1851, it is recalled that, quote, where a person got a new coat, he would raise the rent. No man was allowed to sow the second crop without manuring it, or if he did, he would be evicted. Other famine-related stories in Offaly include that of the tradition of carrying bread as people passed locations known as the Hungry Grass, where famine victims had died. Likewise, the memory of the affray at Calahi, where 2 police constables died as they intervened in the removal of crops in 1849, is kept alive in both song and story. Indeed, the ballad Calahi Barracks, which recalls the daring act of John Keyes and others, is often sung at social gatherings. In local lore, Keyes was concealed under a cargo of bricks and brought to Dublin, from where he escaped to America. The ballad concludes with the promise that someday there will be a welcome home for Keyes. It goes, there was a lad amongst them, and young Johnny was his name it may be honoured upon the book of fame. He was forced to leave his native isle, in a foreign land to roam. We'll have bonfires blazing on Lortown Hill when Johnny does come home. Elsewhere, local poetry also depicts the defiance of tenants against the might of landlord and agent during the famine years. The poem The Boys of Gortine, for example, recalls that we cried down with coercion, rack rents and evictions, the bailiff, the sheriff and the crowbar brigade. In 1994, Offaly County Council commissioned a commemorative map of the sites associated with the Great Famine in the county, ahead of the 150th anniversary of the famine. This map, as you will see on your screen, contains the various workhouses, famine graveyards, relief roads and other associated sites with An Gorta Mór, or the Great Famine of the 1840s. Although we now know much of the suffering of the people of Offaly during this time, there still is, even at the remove of 175 years, much to learn about the effects of the Great Famine on this county.